city of Newcastle upon Tyne, situated in the northeast of England, has a current population of over 280,000. Situated on the north bank of the River Tyne, for 100 years it was a great industrial centre where coal had originally been king. Gradually, however, heavy engineering and other industries such as shipbuilding began to take over. Between 1935 and 1966, Newcastle was home to an impressive trolleybus system, and although the electric buses have been gone for over 30 years, the sleek, silent vehicles with their cradles of overhead wires still arouse fond memories amongst older Tynesiders. Horse trams had arrived in the city in 1879, electrification following in late 1901. Operating on standard gauge track, the network eventually radiated out in all directions from the city centre. This was one of the 100 cars ordered for the opening. It formed part of a group of Hearst Nelson single truckers and is now rebuilt to its original form. A few years after its delivery, it had been fitted with a balcony top cover. Sold to Sheffield in 1941, it was totally enclosed and ran for another 10 years. Beautifully restored and painted in its original chocolate maroon and cadmium yellow, 114 now transports delighted visitors around the Beamish Open Air Museum, which is situated some 7 miles from Newcastle in the county of Durham. Also at the museum is number 10, in the sparkling crimson and white livery of the former Gateshead and District Tramways Company, which once operated 12.5 miles of electric tramway in the borough of Gateshead, situated opposite Newcastle on the south bank of the Tyne. This company-built 48-seater dated from the mid-20s. By 1948, Gateshead had a fleet of 76 cars. To replace their trams, both Newcastle and Gateshead had powers to operate trolleybuses, but in 1950 the latter opted to relinquish them. In contrast, between 1935 and 1948, Newcastle replaced several tram routes and then continued to expand its trolleybus system until 1957. It was possible that these same two vehicles could have been seen together in central Newcastle. During the period 1948 to 1950, Newcastle purchased a totally new fleet of 2- and 3-axle vehicles. On abandonment, only 2 escaped into preservation, including 501, this Sunbeam S7 of 1948. Now part of the Beamish Museum collection, it is of considerable local importance in that it has a Northern coach builder's body, which was manufactured at the NCB factory in Newcastle. Although Newcastle and Gateshead were linked by several bridges, the two tramways were not connected until tracks were laid on the lower deck of the high-level bridge in 1923. Note the single-decker under the coupled pair of D49s. This railway bridge dated from 1849. And the nearby swing bridge from 1879. When the impressive new Tyne Bridge opened in 1928, it also carried the last tramway extension to be built on Tyneside. The total length was 1,304 feet, with a central span of 531 feet. Its height above the high water level, 84 feet. Following the initial burst of electrification, some 20 further extensions were built. These scenes, filmed in 1913, were taken on the opening day of the tracks down the steeply graded Benton Bank in the northeast of the city. Later trolleybuses would also surge effortlessly up and down the same hill. The trio of E-class trams involved in the opening ceremony represented the most modern vehicles in the city's growing fleet. 198 to 200 were all corporation-built 55-seater balcony cars mounted on Brill 21E trucks. Power was supplied by two 40-horsepower motors. They formed part of a batch of 17 dating from 1913-14. The city had started constructing its own passenger trams in 1904, a practice which they continued into the 20s. Led by number 200, procession powers proudly up the 1 in 11 grade. Eventually, the E-class were to total some 40 cars, some of which survived in service until after the Second World War. Following the extension over the high-level bridge in January 1923, the tramway network underwent radical transformation. The public were now offered a comprehensive cross-river service with a complex pattern of jointly operated through routes. Gateshead local lines were also extended to various points in central Newcastle. Following the horse bus was a much rebuilt Newcastle Hearst Nelson car of 1902. In contrast, the Gateshead Company was showing off one of its 7 new front-exit brush-built 70-seaters. Among the throng of civic dignitaries, sporting a goatee and a grey Homburg hat, was Alderman Main, long-serving chairman of the Tramways Committee. Some 15 months later, the great and good were again out in force, this time to attend the inauguration of the Gosforth Park Light Railway. Opened in April 1924, this picturesque 1.5-mile extension ran on double track from the Great North Road through Gosforth Park. One of the en route features was a 1,700-foot-long embankment, complete with private bridge. This is still in situ today. Another feature was this 1,500-foot-long cutting. The main intermediate public stop was at the 4-track grandstand station, adjacent to the city's racecourse, which the line had been built to serve. Passing through the gates marking the eastern limits of the park, these posts are still standing today, the trams wended their way back towards the city via a series of narrow country lanes, thus offering the possibility of a circular service. The car in the distance was one of the C-class single-deckers given short upper decks in the early 20s. They were nicknamed submarines. Reflecting the isolated nature of the line, from 1928 the tracks were only used during the summer months, when open toppers trundled round the 11-mile circle at an inclusive adult fare of 6pence, or 2.5p. Despite the unique route number 000, this highly popular service was suspended on the outbreak of war in 1939. Mounted on Peckham P22 trucks, 274, which performed the opening run, was part of a batch of 25 brush-built cars delivered in 1923. They represented the city's final type of standard tram. Nicknamed glass houses, the first of these totally enclosed, rear-loading, front-exit B-class cars had entered service in 1917, examples being built until as late as 1926. Eventually, there was a total of 75. Amongst the crowd was the then General Manager, Ernest Hatton, seen on the left. Despite the plethora of cross-river trams, amazingly the private-owned Halfpenny Lops continued clopping across the high-level bridge until withdrawn in June 1931. At the start of the 30s, Newcastle had some 300 trams, operating over 51 miles of track, whilst the Gateshead Company had some 60 cars on 20 miles of track. But in Newcastle, the long-term future of the tram was about to be challenged. The city's famous blue buses had first appeared as feeders to the trams in 1912, but by 1930 they were serving many of the rapidly expanding outer suburbs. Trolley buses had first been considered in 1911, but it was not until May 1934 that the City Council approved plans to obtain the necessary parliamentary powers. In debate it was argued that trolley vehicles would continue utilising locally produced electricity, and that some of the tramway infrastructure could easily be adapted. Also, by converting tram routes, it would alleviate the need to remove miles of worn-out track. Having obtained the relevant powers, the trams were effectively condemned. However, owing to the outbreak of the Second World War, the last battered remnants did not finally bow out until 1950. The first east-west trolleybus routes began full public service on Tuesday, the 1st of October 1935. In the east, they displaced trams between the centre and Wallsend Park Road, whilst in the west they extended beyond the old tram terminus Fox and Hounds by means of a two-way loop to Denton Burn. To evaluate the various vehicles on the market, chassis, bodies, motors and electrical equipment were ordered from different manufacturers. 10 to 14 had AEC 664T chassis, everything else being supplied by English Electric. 15 to 19 differed only in that they had brush bodies. 20 to 29 were Carrier E6As with Metro Camel bodies and Metrovic motors and equipment. 30 to 39 had Guy BTX chassis and Metro Camel bodies. Deliveries until 1940 were all either AEC 664Ts, Carrier E6As or Guy BTXs. The only exception was 112, which had a Daimler CTM6 chassis. All the dual-entrance metal bodies were ordered from Metro Camel until 1937. Number 78, delivered in the same year, had a row body of composite construction, 12 similar vehicles following during the next 3 years. 109 of 1938 had the first Northern Coach Builders body. Built in Newcastle, this handsome vehicle had a raised waistband below the upper and lower deck windows, as well as a flatter roof dome at the front. These first-generation trolleybuses were very much products of the period. This was a time of graceful streamlining. At the city's central station, the superb Gresley-designed A4 Pacific locomotives were regular visitors. Here, Silver Fox backs down onto a London Express, the Silver Jubilee, which consisted of Gresley-designed articulated coaches. Carriers 113 to 124, delivered in 1940, were the last trolleybuses to have the distinctive dual doors. The war prevented further tramway conversions, leaving some 250 cars on 31 route miles. To assist with increased loadings, trolleybuses from Bournemouth and Brighton travelled north on loan. Then, in 1942, 10 elderly six-wheelers were purchased from Bradford. At first they kept their Bradford fleet numbers, but were eventually allocated the numbers 1 to 9 and 0. These English electric veterans, dating from 1929 to 1931, usually only ventured out at rush hours, running from Pilgrim Street to the East End until 1948. Between 1943 and 1945, 6 much-needed utilities joined the fleet. All were 56-seater Carrier W4s, the majority having Park Royal bodies like these, the exceptions being 137 and 138, which had Waymans. All 16 had a relatively short life, the last being withdrawn in 1956. Despite wartime restrictions, the Elsick Road route was converted to trolleybuses in 1944. The closure also allowed for abandonment of the tracks leading to Wingrove Depot. The replacing trolleybuses were extended westwards. Only the Throckley-Scotswood trams remained in the western suburbs, but the semi-rural section beyond Scotswood was abandoned in 1946. After the war, tram scrapping began in earnest. Amazingly, F-Class 102 was to escape the torch. It was filmed here on the Great North Road just prior to the arrival of the trolleybuses. After languishing in various locations, it now forms part of the National Tramway Museum fleet at Cryche in Derbyshire. Built by Newcastle Corporation, 102 was one of a batch of 22 cars dating from 1903. Over the years, most were rebuilt, some with top covers, lengthened platforms, vestibules and extended top decks. Frequently, loads in excess of 200 were reputed to have crammed on board when carrying football and race crowds. This impressive veteran represents one of the largest trams ever to have run in Britain. These rare scenes show the neglected trams together with the more modern but equally run-down trolleybuses in the immediate post-war period, when both fleets were still struggling to carry thousands of dockers, shipyard workers, engineers, schoolchildren and shoppers. With shortages of spare parts and reduced levels of maintenance, most vehicles displayed obvious signs of wear and tear. The distinctive dark blue livery on the corporation buses was set to disappear from 1949 onwards. A short working trolleybus from Walker passes a Gateshead Company car on Pilgrim Street. By this time, the bulk of the Newcastle fleet consisted of the 75 glass houses. Sit back, soak up the atmosphere, as the camera offers tantalizing glimpses of a lost age, just before all these war-weary trams and the pre-war trolleybuses were about to make their one-way trip to the scrapyard. Coming up on the right, a brief view of the last A-Class Hearst Nelson number 120 of 1901. Probably because their parent company, British Traction Electric, were unenthusiastic about trolleybuses, the Gateshead Company opted to relinquish its trolleybus powers in 1950 in favour of motorbuses. This in spite of having costed a full conversion programme. Sadly, the prospect of corporation and company trolleybuses sharing the same wires had gone. The post-war tramway closures involved the Gosforth Park Light Railway. Latterly, these rusting tracks were used to store cars awaiting scrap. Although powers existed to operate trolleybuses through the park, they were never implemented. The ears for the trolleybus wires were already in situ when these views were taken shortly before the Great North Road lost its trams in April 1948. This abandonment also involved removal of trams from Haymarket and Barras Bridge. Peak-hour-only trams continued to rattle out to the turning circle at Scotswood until replaced by buses in September 1949, regular service having ceased the previous October. Then, in March 1950, the remaining jointly operated routes with Gateshead finally came to an end. In turn, Gateshead replaced its trams during 1950-51. These next views being taken on the last route to Dunston. Reversing outside the central station in the heart of Newcastle in July 1951 was company car number 10, now preserved at Beamish. Approaching Central Station, having crossed the high-level bridge. Entering Wellington Street with Gateshead East Station on the right. Owing to several low bridges, only single-deckers could be used on the Dunston route. Built in 1902, 46 had originally been open-fronted, whilst company-built number 15 dated from the early 20s. Squealing round the sharply angled curve at the junction of Askew Road and Pine Street. Straddling Gut Bridge, which had replaced a much older structure in 1934. Dunston was a classic short-haul route, with single track and loops serving a mixture of grimy industrial and residential neighbourhoods. Dipping beneath the two railway bridges just before the terminus in Gasworks Bridge Road, less than 2 miles from the town centre. When the route closed, trams disappeared from Tyneside for nearly 40 years. Then in 1990 they returned as part of the Gateshead Garden Festival. Intriguingly, the specially constructed track actually crossed the long-abandoned Dunston route at right angles. The assembled fleet included a former London Transport experimental Feltham, which had ended its operating days in nearby Sunderland, and also the giant open-top F-Class 102. Unfortunately, none of the preserved Gateshead cars was available at the time. Back in 1951, there had still been a limited market for second-hand trams, so 19 of the Gateshead single-deckers went to Grimsby and Immingham, where one was converted into a general-purpose works car. Here it was to survive with some of its sisters until this unique line closed in July 1961. In 1946, Newcastle renumbered all its existing trolleybuses. 326 was one of the 1935 Metrocamel Carrier E6As. It had seats for 60, 27 in the lower saloon and 33 upstairs. The bulk of the pre-war fleet was replaced between 1949 and 1950. The dual doors typified all deliveries up until arrival of the more conventional utilities. Star of this sequence was 334, one of the 10 Metro camel-bodied Guy BTXs, also of 1935. To operate new routes and to start displacing some of the original fleet, 20 30-foot-long, 8-foot-wide BUT 9641Ts with 70-seater Metro Camel bodies were delivered in early 1948. Built at the same time as the famous London Transport Q1s, 479 to 498 spent nearly all their active life on the Great North Road and were soon nicknamed Gosforth buses by the staff. For the tram conversions of November 1948, 30 Sunbeam S7s with 70-seater Northern coach builders bodies were ordered. Being long and thin, they were 30 foot by 7 foot 6 inches, numbers 499 to 528 were given the somewhat morbid sobriquet coffins. 3 batches of 2-axle vehicles were also delivered. Nicknamed Doodlebugs, 443 to 478 were Sunbeam F4s with 56-seat Metro Camel bodies. The second group, 529 to 553, were Sunbeam F4s, but this time with Northern coach builders bodies. The same firm also supplied the bodies for 554 to 578, which had BUT 9611T chassis. They took up service in mid-1949. The 2-axle fleet tended to be allocated to the various circular routes introduced in January 1949. The last 50 new trolley vehicles, numbers 579 to 628, entered service in 1950. Being virtually identical to the 1948 batch of Q1s with Metro Camel bodies and BUT 9641T chassis, they were sometimes referred to as Q2s. By the start of the 50s, therefore, Newcastle boasted a thoroughly modern fleet of electric buses, which intermingled with the rich mix serving the city. For the celebration surrounding the coronation of the present Queen in June 1903, 2 buses were specially decorated, including BUT 596. Resplendent in gold and adorned with portraits and shields, both all existing routes. 1953 also witnessed withdrawal of most of the wartime utilities, although the 6 Park Royals continued until 1956. 431 had formerly been 131. The last major trolleybus extension, which increased the route mileage up to nearly 36.5, opened on the 21st of October 1956. Included was a direct link between Denton Burn and a new modern depot, seen here. Built at a cost of nearly £200,000, with accommodation for 60 buses and 60 trolley vehicles, Slateford allowed the corporation to close the old turn-of-the-century Wingrove depot. Access to and from Slateford depot was considerably improved when in 1959 the junctions at Denton Burn were completely redesigned. A roundabout was built with various overhead connections which allowed trolleybuses to reach the depot from most directions. At the beginning of the 60s, the system seemed secure, but in a report by F.S. Taylor, the general manager, he recommended phasing out the network by 1968. The full council reluctantly acquiesced. The case against the trolleybus was all too familiar. First and foremost, because of their fixed installations, they were charged with hindering city centre redevelopment. Also, it was argued, it was just as cost-effective to operate buses. Overhead wires were unsightly. New vehicles were increasingly difficult to obtain. Strenuous objections were voiced, but to no avail. The undertaking had turned its back on the trolleybus. Within a short space of time, owing to central area road construction, notices appeared announcing replacement of the first route in June 1963. The 34s passed through areas of considerable contrast as they wound across town following much of the original wiring opened in 1935. At the eastern end, the trolleys were deep in shipyard territory, serving giants like Vickers Armstrong and Swan Hunter Wigham Richardson. In the borough of Wallsend, an area of tightly knit housing adjacent to the neighbouring shipyards, the reversing Y was situated in Vine Street. For most of the run into the city, the 34s hugged the north bank of the Tyne. Passing through the junction at the foot of Welbeck Road, this was also a turning point for some 35s, and was heavily used by shipyard workers during peak hours. Close by were the yards which owned the Mid-Tyne ferry. By 1949, the very frequent crossings were served by 3 diesel-powered vessels. Once used by 1 million people a year, numbers had dwindled to under 200 a day as the river-based industries declined, at which point Swan Hunters, the final owners, opted for closure in July 1986. The gantry-style overhead, dating from 1935, typified most of the eastern wing of the 34. These 1960 scenes show trolleybuses threading through redevelopment at the junction of Walker Road and Church Street. As every other 34 terminated here, there was a 7.5-minute headway into town. Crossing Glasshouse Bridge. Situated close to the nearby quays, the bridge, dating from 1878, spanned the Ouse Burn, which fed into the Tyne at this point. The structure was 336 feet long and 37.5 feet above the high water mark. The gantry cross tube spanning the bridge had allowed for continued use of former tram poles, suitably strengthened to support 4 or 6 wires in lieu of the original 2. In the vicinity of Glasshouse Bridge was the intriguing single-track goods-only railway from Trafalgar Yard near Mannersea Station down to Quayside. Electrified in 1905 by the North Eastern Railway, the 1-mile branch had 3 tunnels and severe grades of up to 1 in 27. Until February 1964, it was worked by 2 venerable Bobo locos built by the Brush Engineering Company. Third rail was used in the low-roof tunnel, but overhead in the yards. The changeover being effected by 2 hand-operated knife switches in the cab of the locos. For safety reasons, they were 2-manned and were restricted to a maximum load of 160 tons on the incline. Each train also incorporated a special 20-ton brake van with sandboxes on both open platforms. The branch was finally closed not long afterwards. On its final leg into the city, the 34 swept past the sombre buildings flanking City Road. Yet more electric traction. At one point near Manners Station, the trolleybuses passed under the railway carrying the distinctive Tyneside electrics, introduced in 1904. These provided a circular service linking Newcastle with the coastal towns to the east of the city. The lines, having been de-electrified in 1967, now form part of the electrically powered Tyne and Wear Metro. This baggage car, built by Metro Camel, dated from 1938. A trolleybus takes the S-bend leading from City Road into Mosley Street. Short working 34s turned on a nearby loop in St Nicholas Street. Passing close to the statue of George Stephenson, Tyneside's most illustrious engineer. Occasionally, operations could be disrupted. However, these sequences, recorded in the early 60s, show how swift action kept the trolleybuses moving, even when a nearby fire threatened to close the roadway. Under the watchful eye of inspectors, the drivers simply manoeuvred round the affected area using their batteries, the trolley booms being safely hooked down. Amongst applications levelled at trolleybus, one is flexibility. In reality, with careful supervision, they were capable of overcoming most obstacles with the minimum of delay. A rear view of a 34A. Following the all clear from the fire brigade, it would be booms up and back to business. On the west side of the city, the 34 ran out to Denton Square and was the first of the routes tackling Westgate Hill to be replaced, when as from Whit Sunday the 2nd of June 1963, Leyland Atlanteans took over, lopping some 10 minutes off the former trolleybus timing of 45 minutes. However, this was achieved by eliminating several stops. The next spate of closures occurred in early 1964, with the loss of 7 more services, including the trunk routes along the Great North Road. As well as those serving South Gosford, Matthew Bank, and in Benton, Swarland Avenue. Also included were the circulars 39 and 40, which were not directly replaced. The closure wiped out the wires in most of the north and northeast of the city, where most of the routes served predominantly residential areas. Each abandonment reduced not only the presence, but the variety of trolleybuses in the city centre. This was because the corporation had decided to scrap the 2-axle fleet and retain the higher capacity 6-wheelers to the end. So, following closure of the 34, 9 of the NCB Sunbeam F4s have been withdrawn, together with all the remaining Metro Camel F4s, some of which had gone for scrap as early as December 1961. The February 1964 conversions allowed the corporation to withdraw all the surviving 4-wheelers, despite the fact that many bodies were in better shape than those on the Sunbeam S7s. These scenes, taken variously between 1959 and 1964, catch the spirit of the system, when the electric trolley vehicles proudly dominated the city centre, and the 86 4-wheelers were very much in evidence, especially on the crosstown 37s and 38s and the 4 circular routes. Traction action captured at key intersections. For example, Cook's Corner, where some 16 trolleybus routes thumped under the nest of wires at Newbridge Street, Northumberland Street intersection. The main city terminus was conveniently situated outside Central Station. Endless lines of trolleybuses streamed along Neville Street past the front of John Dobson's magnificent station building, en route to the roundabout at the end of the street, which also acted as a turning circle. To help alleviate congestion at peak hours, some buses entered the terminal loops by way of Buick Street and Clayton Street West. At the start of 1964, 7 services, including all the derivations of the 31, still terminated outside the station at the taxi rank. The 39 and 40 had also terminated here until April 1962, when they had been curtailed at Newgate Street. Overlooked by St Mary's Cathedral, an outbound 31A heads north towards Grange Estate via Northumberland Street. From this area in front of the station, trams had once loaded on 4 tracks, and from a spot close by, the last Gateshead cars had rumbled into oblivion in August 1951. 10 years later, the trolleybuses still seemed impregnable, with constant convoys arriving and departing, swallowing up the crowds emerging from the station and the nearby offices. Buick Street was used in both directions at peak hours. These vehicles were proceeding north up Clayton Street West prior to turning into Buick Street. Doodlebug 473, one of the first post-war vehicles to be withdrawn in October 1962. 554, the lowest numbered of the NCB batch of 25 BUTs. Rows of trolleybuses lined up at the lights. For example, in Pilgrim Street. These were very much synonymous with the Newcastle rush hour in the 50s and 60s. More activity at Cook's Corner. Here another Metro Camel Sunbeam was on a short working 35C. This class could be distinguished by their less rounded roof ends. To and from the city, the 31s and 31As used Northumberland Street to gain the Haymarket. Whilst the 31B travelled via Clayton, Newgate and Percy Streets. All 3 routes joined forces at Barras Bridge. Emergency repairs were being carried out to the heavily used automatic Frog, which separated the Great North Road and Jesmond Road wiring some distance from the actual road junction itself. In the opposite direction, a conductor has to alight from an inbound 43 to pull the lever to change the hand-operated Frog leading into Northumberland Street. Another view of the automatic Frog, with a vehicle taking the inner wires heading for Gosforth. For such an intensive system, there were only ever 5 automatic Frogs, all being installed after the war. An inbound Q2 purrs towards Haymarket, overlooked by buildings in Jesmond Road. The X and F on this pole indicated a crossing and a Frog. Approaching Haymarket and then looking towards St Thomas Church. After passing through the junction with the pre-war Osborne Road services, the 1948 wiring took the trolleybuses speeding up the A1 for about a mile, with the open space of Town Moor on the left, before approaching the 3-way junction with Grandstand Road and Jesmond Dean Road. This was another location to warrant an automatic Frog. Occupying the centre of the roadway, a four-wheeler prepares to make a right turn en route to Matthew Bank. Two city-bound Gosforth buses coast under the complex web of wiring. Southbound at Little Gosforth Bridge. Roughly 2 miles from town, the 31s had crossed the county line into Gosforth UDC, situated in Northumberland. The busy high street, with its rows of shops, acted as a magnet for many living in North Newcastle. During the 50s, the trolley buses all too often were reduced to a crawl, as the number of cars, lorries and vans on the A1 had increased dramatically. Heading north was a United bus, followed closely by a 1950 BUT. Crossing the Pontyland Railway branch on the bridge at West Gosforth. Immediately to the north was a short spur leading into Hollywood Avenue. Built to serve two nearby sports facilities, the terminal loop could accommodate 15 trolley buses. A long siding was also provided on the A1 outside the North Road entrance of the Greyhound Stadium. Responding to the unstoppable growth in traffic, from 1950 the A1 was gradually widened, starting at West Gosforth Bridge and working northwards. Pulling the lever to activate the hand-operated frog, which will take this outbound 31A onto the wires leading to Grange Estate. Opened in October 1951, the quarter-mile branch catered for a new housing complex, as well as nearby government office buildings. The terminal loop, some 4 miles from Central Station, curved round a triangular green on the fringes of the countryside. Broadway West was a concrete thoroughfare with span wire construction throughout. Rejoining the A1 on the 22-minute trip to town. The penultimate loop used by Route 31B was at Polwarth Drive, situated in Castle Ward Rural District Council. Again, it was nip, smartly off, pull the lever, hop back and snatch a few minutes layover time. Suggestions that the wire should be extended along Polwarth Drive on the left into Brunton Park Estate came to nothing, although the replacing buses did follow this routing. All this length of the A1 had been transformed into a dual carriageway only a few years earlier, in 1957-8. The southbound carriageway, built 50 yards to the east of the original road, was entirely new. Northumberland County Council paid for the overhead to be repositioned, utilising bracket arms, as the overall width of the extended highway ruled out the possibility of span wires. To keep the traffic flowing smoothly, V-shaped laybys were provided at some stops. 496 comes to rest during the final week of operation. After posing for the camera, the driver clambers into the cab at the start of the 22-minute run to Central Station. Still heading north, the outer limit of the wiring was at Gosforth Park West Gates. Interestingly, this section of the A1 had not yet been widened. Passing in front of the gates through which the trams had once ventured deep into the park. A last day scene, with Gosforth 489 on the same route it had served since 1948. Although powers to operate trolleybuses into the park had not been exercised, extras were still provided on race days. In the city, these normally loaded close to the Central Station in Buick Street. The high-capacity 70-seater trolleybuses were ideal crush loaders for handling the thousands flocking to the Hoppings, the giant race week fair held annually during the last week of June. To cater for the enormous crowds, a controversial turning circle had been cut into a tiny section of the town moor. Here, a hopping special turns onto Grandstand Road on its way to the loop, which was protected at either end by gates, which were locked when the loop was not in use. Back in 1948, objections had been raised because another piece of the moor had been lost. Held in perpetuity by the city on condition it was not built on, the 900 acres of moor remains a vital lung in the middle of a major conurbation. However, the Grandstand Road turning circle proved invaluable in reducing dead mileage and the number of vehicles required. It was last used for the 1963 hoppings. The Phase 2 closure spelt the end of the 39 and 40 circulars introduced in January 1949. Having looped through South Gosforth, a 39 follows a 1948 Gosforth into town. Turning east at Town Moor towards South Gosforth. Twisting and turning through the hillier parts of Matthew Bank. These relatively lightly loaded circulars, very much the domain of the NCB-bodied four-wheelers, straggle through the north and northeastern residential suburbs on a 15-minute headway. For the many employees at the headquarters of the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance, a lengthy siding was provided on Benton Park Road. For the same purpose, there was another siding as well as a turning circle at Swarland Avenue, terminus of the crosstown 37s and 38s, both of which ran to Denton Road terminus in the West End. The 37 via Heaton and the 38s by way of Jesmond Road. Following the closures of February 1964, only the 41 and 42 would still tackle the steep gradient on Benton Bank, and all the four-wheelers would be gone. At full throttle on the stretch of Jesmond Road immediately before the bridge over the railway at Ilford Road near West Jesmond Station. A Northern Coach Builders BUT edges onto the Great North Road. This bus would soon be scrapped, but the 42 would linger on until May 1965. Barras Bridge. This quartet at the Granger Street Market Street junction offers a wonderful reminder of the Newcastle system at its peak, when part of Granger Street once carried 168 trolleybuses an hour at peak times. Having run through the central area, the 37s and 38s continued to terminate at Denton Road. To eliminate an awkward and increasingly dangerous loop, a new anti-clockwise turning circle was opened in the early summer of 1962 at a cost of over £12,700. Built on top of Denton-Burn Stream, which had been culverted, it also involved one of the last major wiring alterations undertaken. It was now time for the remaining four-wheelers to be pensioned off. Most of these 56-seaters had only clocked up some 15 years of service, the majority still being structurally and mechanically sound when sold to the scrapman. BUT 567 showed off the smart lines of its locally built NCB body as it swooped towards the foot of Neville Street. Another NCB product, but this time on a Sunbeam F4 chassis. Finally, sister vehicle 531. The third phase of the conversion program, which occurred on May the 30th, 1965, was dubbed the Great Slaughter by local enthusiasts. 9 more services and 11 route miles were wiped out, including the surviving workmen's journey still running out to Wallsend Park Road, former terminus of the long-abandoned Route 34. 2 depots, both of which dated from the latter part of the 50s, also lost their trolleybus allocations. Trolleybuses were now set to disappear entirely from Fenham. The reversing Y, situated in Bingfield Gardens, was terminus for the 32, which then crossed town to Wallsend boundary. The wiring in the background on the right led into Slateford Depot. Also running through Fenham were the 36 and 44. These form part of the complex pattern of routes introduced in October 1956. A Q1 bound for Wallsend boundary turns out of Fenham Hall Drive onto Barrack Road for a swift run into the city. Known to be a speed track, drivers would often touch 40 miles an hour as they powered their way past Fenham Barracks and the fringes of Town Moor. This inbound S7 was at the junction of Barrack Road and Stanhope Street. Across town in Walkerville, the 32s travelled along Shields Road, dipping under Skew Bridge, which carried the Tyneside Electrics. A 5-mile-an-hour speed restriction allowed the trolley booms to be forced down and out to the side of the low bridge. The 32 was the only Newcastle route with Ys at either end, the one at Wallsend boundary seen here being in Oak Tree Avenue. From this point it was just under 6 miles back to Fenham. The Y was also used by certain workmen's services running to various parts of the West End, and for depot journeys to Byker. Slateyford depot was set to lose its trolleybus allocation as part of the Phase 3 conversion. Dating from 1956, this modern facility had accommodation for 120 vehicles, equally divided between buses and trolleybuses. Following the February 1964 closures, the two most westerly bays had already been given over to the city's increasing army of diesel buses. At its height, Slateyford had provided trolleybuses for 7 routes. This Q2, the lowest numbered of the group, had just completed a spell of duty on the 43. All the wiring at the junction of Netherby Drive and Silver Lonnon, including the access up to the depot, had been erected in 1956 and was under 9 years old. Skimming south along the Lonnon towards Denton Bank and the roundabout installed in 1959. The various connections gave swift access to and from Slateyford depot, situated approximately 1 mile to the north. A city-bound 36 turns onto Silver Lonnon. Since Phase 2, only the 5.5-mile crosstown 33 had used the anti-clockwise loop at Denton Road terminus. The reverser at Delaval Road, where the Ministry of Transport had originally wanted a turning circle, was destined to survive the Great Slaughter, becoming the western limit of the 35C. Drivers using this Y had to run back at an angle onto the steeply graded street before drawing forward to cross onto a short siding situated on the north side of Benwell Lane. The wiring west of this reverser would now all fall into disuse. In rush hours, this was a major turning point, with lines of trolleybuses waiting to reverse in order to run back into the city. Probably the most unusual Newcastle reverser was to be found half a mile away, amongst the older property near Benwell Church. Mainly confined to rush hour workings, terminating vehicles crossed against the traffic flow onto the wrong side of a congested main road before reversing gingerly into Nicholl Street. The top of Westgate Hill was known locally as Big Lamp Junction, after the multi-globe gas lamp which had once illuminated this intersection. Prior to May 1965, 13 routes either terminated or passed through central Newcastle. Most of the major thoroughfares still nestled under the shadow of tons of overhead wiring. However, following Phase 3, the role of the trolleybus would diminish drastically. For example, only the 35s would still skirt round Gray's Monument, and routes would no longer terminate at Central Station. Prior to the conversion, 3 of the routes still running to and from the station were actually interlinked and operated by the same vehicle. For example, a 44 would depart for Fenham, change there to a 33 or 33A, and make a cross-town journey to Osborne Road. Journey time 53 minutes, for just under 10 miles. Then it would return as a 43 to Denton Road, where it would again change, this time to a 36, for a trip to the station via Fenham. Sweeping past Dobson's magnificent soot-stained portico along the 80-foot wide Neville Street, which since 1955 had been divided by a central reservation. Under the beneficent eye of St Mary's Roman Catholic Cathedral, all trolleybuses terminating at the station use this roundabout at the end of Neville Street. To keep the trolleybuses moving, there were 2 sets of wires, a scissors crossover, a double slip, and further passing loops. The P-car-only 33B avoided Central Station by operating to and from Monument Siding at Eldon Square to either Benwell Church or Delaval Road, thereby providing much-needed extra capacity on the densely populated Elsick Road. Turning for Monument Siding, a somewhat dingy 479 noses cautiously from Clayton Street into Blackett Street. Another depot to lose its trolleybuses was Handysides. In fact, it was hardly a depot at all. It consisted of a pair of wires strung up at the top end of a crudely surfaced car park on Morden Street. As such, it offered open accommodation for a dozen trolleybuses and was probably first used in January 1958 to partially replace Haymarket Depot, closed the previous December. Outside the rush hour, the parking area was normally full, although there was no overnight stabling. The site also had space for 18 buses. Further wiring set to disappear included the 2-mile prong into Jesmond, an area of tree-lined roads and owner-occupied houses. This had been the only route to penetrate the northeastern suburbs prior to the post-war extensions. The terminus at Osborne Road consisted of a one-way loop, used latterly by 3 cross-city services. The 5.5-mile 33 to Denton Road, the 4 3/4-mile short-working 33A to Delaval Road only, and the 43, which formed part of the complex pattern of routes extending into the western suburbs and eventually ending back at the station. Another loss was Benton Bank. Only the circulars 41 and 42 still surged up and down the grades of 1 in 11 and 1 in 12. This S7 on the clockwise 41 will shortly turn south onto Heaton Road. Journey time for both routes 36 minutes to complete the 5.25-mile circle. Since their inception in 1949, these 2 services had until February 1964 been the preserve of the 2-axle fleet. A 41 turns onto Shields Road Byker, joining the throng of trolleybuses which provided an intensive service between the city and this important eastern suburb. Just up the road, trolley heads constantly thumped their way through the maze of frogs at the junction of Shields Road with Union Road. In early 1965, Byker was still very much trolleybus territory, with only the 37 having been replaced. On top of the many depot workings, 7 routes still ran through, together with the various shipyard specials going out to Wallsend Park Road. These P-car journeys, provided for local shipyard workers, operated for the final mile over wiring last regularly used in May 1963. It had also been one of the first sections of trolleybus route to open 30 years previously in October 1935. Shortly prior to final abandonment, a Q1 negotiated the Vine Street Y. More familiar vehicles were now on their way to the scrap merchant, including all the remaining Gosforth buses, the 1948 Q1s. Joining them were the locally built Northern Coach Builders Sunbeam S7s, also of 1948. These coffins would all too soon be dead and buried. Inroads were also made into the 1950 BUTs, 11 of the class, including 598, being withdrawn after the Phase 3 conversions. This would leave just 39 Q2s in stock. Despite the end being in sight, although no precise date had yet been announced, major redevelopment led to substantial alterations being made to the overhead in Walker, following withdrawal of trolleybuses from Church Street. As from the 22nd of August 1965, the 35s were extended from Welbeck Road via Proctor Street to its junction with Church Street, whilst the 35As were cut short to share the Westbourne Avenue reverser with the 35Cs. All 35Bs were withdrawn. The next sequences were taken during the final months of operation. As from the 1st of June 1965, the 35C only operated irregularly on weekdays, but all day on Saturdays. The closure of Church Street had allowed for the building of the Church Walk Centre in what had been the old village of Walker. For their final 14 months, the 35s turned on what was probably the last new reverser to have been erected in Britain. Surrounded by increasing demolition, the wiring straddled the junction of Proctor Street and Church Street. The 7-mile journey to Denton Square via Brighton Grove took 42 minutes. Rush hour extras still turned at the foot of Welbeck Road to cater for the workers pouring from the adjacent yards and factories. The railway bridge at the east end of Welbeck Road carried the Tyneside electrics on the Riverside Loop. A short length of wiring survived at the north end of Church Street, forming part of the Westbourne Avenue reverser, terminus for the 6.5-mile 35C and the 4-mile 35A. From this point, the various 35s shared common wiring to the city centre, passing en route the rarely used biker reverser, situated at the busy intersection of Welbeck Road and Bottle Street. Overlooked by the giant Odeon, these wires gave access to the nearby biker depot. A 35C prepares to take up service. Denuded of adverts, a city-bound Q2 emerges from the southern entrance of Biker Depot. The main wiring along Fossway, erected as late as 1957, had gone by this time. The Biker Works and Depot, which dated from 1901, had been the largest complex on the system and is still in use today by stagecoach busways. Opened in 1878, the 1,130-foot-long Biker Bridge cuts across the Ouse Burn at a height of 80 feet, making it the longest and highest structure in the UK to be traversed by trolleybuses. To the north and slightly at an angle, it was paralleled by the older railway viaduct. To withstand strong winds, the traction poles on the road bridge were elaborately stayed to achieve maximum rigidity by using gantries and bracing wires. A Foden breakdown truck tows a disgraced trolleybus back to Byker. City-bound on New Bridge Street. A 35C prepares to turn onto Market Street. This would take it on a 2-mile run deep into motorbus territory, bound for its terminus at Delaval Road. Overlooked by the old YMCA, a trolleybus skirted an obstruction in New Bridge Street. Eldon Square. By mid-1966, it was increasingly difficult to remember that only 3 years earlier Newcastle city centre had whirred and hummed to the sounds of electric motors. Now the handful of trolleybuses were clearly outnumbered. 586 accelerates smartly up Gallowgate towards the long loop at St James's Park. Catering for the nearby Newcastle United football ground in Barrack Road, the 4 sets of wires ran together for about 250 yards, as far as the junction with Stanhope Street. Due latterly to insufficient numbers of trolleybuses, the loop was last used during the 1965-66 football season. Vehicles turning onto Barrack Road crossed over the top of the loop before starting their descent into the city. Stanhope Street was the main thoroughfare in the Arthur's Hill district and consisted of a mix of late 19th century shops, pubs and terraced houses, ideal public transport territory. On arrival at Brighton Grove, the 35As which terminated here made use of a one-way loop, slowly turning from Callerton Place onto the layover siding in Brighton Grove. Having come from Denton Square, this city-bound 35 pulls up at the same stop. On Westgate Road and West Road, the 35s followed the course of the original trolleybus route as far as the Fox and Hounds. Here the reverser, one of the first on the system, was little used after mid-1965, hence the display of sparks and flashes. All such potentially dangerous movements were strictly governed by laid-down procedures for both drivers and conductors. Climbing Denton Bank towards the highest point in the city near Benwell High Reservoir. To avoid turning on the trunk A69, the terminus at Denton Square consisted of a lay-by built on private land. Since June 1963, it had also been shared with Atlanteans on the 34, which then paralleled the trolleybuses all the way to the turn-off at Brighton Grove. When it was finally announced the system was to close on the 1st of October, enthusiasts began descending on the city to record what was left for posterity. Many once familiar sights would soon disappear. For example, a tower wagon, standing square in the middle of the road, repairing a broken hangar in Proctor Street, Walker. This was one of 9 Carrier CK3s with Eagle hydraulic towers delivered in 1948, some of which were also used by the lighting department. Most of the highly skilled staff would shortly have to seek other employment. As maintenance declined, dewirements increased. The ever-useful bamboo pole was stowed in a special tube under the chassis. Even the local television stations began to take an interest, recording an interview with General Manager Taylor, who had instigated and overseen the entire conversion program. They also filmed some trolleybuses in action, including this scene on Stanhope Street. they recorded a special tour organised by the Huddersfield Trolleybus Preservation Society. Those on board were eagerly filmed, noting every aspect of the vanishing scene. Some, armed with cine cameras, were taking some of the various views depicted in this video. The tour bus number 626 departed from Byker Depot and then, in true tradition, proceeded to cover every conceivable piece of wiring, performing several contortions in the process. Another dewirement, this one requiring use of the rear emergency window to give access to the roof. Saturday the 1st of October was wrapped in Stygian gloom. As with the recent last tram days in Leeds, Sheffield and Glasgow, the heavens seemed to catch the prevailing mood of impending doom. However, in contrast with the tramway abandonments, no public farewell had been arranged. Officials simply thought the trolleybuses would fade away with a minimum of fuss. By late evening, the persistent drizzle had abated, and outwardly everything seemed normal, as laden Q2s, with their interior light shining through the misted windows, continued to criss-cross the city between Walker and Denton Square. From approximately 10:45, the last through journeys were departing from the outer termini at Delaval Road and Church Street. By midnight, exactly 31 years after their introduction, it was over. The very last trolleybus of all, number 599, running from Denton Square to Byker Depot only, where it arrived at 11:55. Watched by some 200 people, 599 ran into the depot, the doors were closed, and another of the dwindling number of British trolleybus systems was finished. Next day, Newcastle was simply another all-bus city. It seemed as if the long-term future for electric traction was bleak. Huddled and forlorn, the 16-year-old BUTs awaited their fate at Auto Spares, a breaker's yard in Bingley, Yorkshire. Only two escaped the slaughter, 628 of 1950, which was rescued and hustled south. It now resides at the Carlton Colville Museum near Lowestoft. 501, which had been preserved some years earlier by the corporation and stored at Byker. In late 1969, it was towed by an AEC Matador truck to Branspath in County Durham. In recent years, 501 has been at the Beamish Open Air Museum, where it does occasionally make sorties onto the wires. Some of the profit from the sale of this tape and our companion tape, South Shields trolleybuses, will go towards fully restoring this magnificent Sunbeam S7 with its Newcastle-built Northern Coach Builders body. For full details relating to the South Shields video, see the end of this tape. When the long-established Tyneside Electrics finally gave way to diesel trains in 1967, it looked as if the demise of electric traction in the area was complete. However, common sense prevailed, and Tynesiders have benefited hugely from investment in the Tyne and Wear Metro, opened in stages since 1980. These scenes show the prototype unit operating on the test track at Middle Engine Lane, Wall's End in the late 1970s. In this contemporary scene, a metro train passes close to the former Byker Depot, once at the centre of one of the finest tram and trolleybus systems in England.